It's the 13th of September 2021. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Dana Durnford, the nuclear proctologist.org. And you can call into the show at 709-589-4406. 709-589-4406. We had 12 people on the stream when I started, and now we got 6. Welcome to hell. Welcome to hell. Hope everybody is doing okay. So we're going to talk about die-offs, birds, animals, whales, mammals. Hi everyone. We counted the tanks at Fukushima. There's 750, 150 of them are small ones. Always takes me a second to get in the rock mode, rock and roller mode. Fukushima has humanity on the brink of a possible worldwide nuclear holocaust. Worldwide, that's the entire biosphere. It's not just humans, it's all species. We're the apex predators. And so insects and bacteria and the phytoplankton and the basis, which is the basis of the food chain, the oxygen, the carbon sequestering chain, is exterminated. And you'll understand it if you hang around. These are complicated stories, so I'm going to set the stage for the first 15 minutes, and then we'll rock through the latest die-offs, and we got some just amazing stories. Fukushima plant is hemorrhaging radioactivity, hemorrhaging. You'll hear bleeding and leaking. And get them in the headlock and give them the uppercut like the hockey players do when you hear that. Scariest part of all is they don't know where it's coming from. The scariest part of it is you don't know where it's coming from, is more like it. Deteriorating plant threatens mass extinction around the world. Mass extinction. So they're talking about species die-off. Radioactive sea spray has been shown to blow hundreds of kilometers inland. So the coastlines, insects, the study's shown how insects are acclimated to more salt in their diet for up to 200 kilometers inland because of the way salt is liberated from the ocean. But radiation is liberated the same way from the ocean as salt is. And so sea spray has been shown to blow hundreds of kilometers inland. So cesium remains dispersed throughout the water column from the surface to the ocean floor. And there's 1,000 fission products. The reactors actually run on plutonium and uranium, not cesium. And the biggest byproduct of the radiated fuel rods is curium isotopes, which killed all the animals in all the studies. All the big old dogs and big old puppies, for instance, died. Dr. Raymond Gilmedy studies. And curium isotope, you need lead shielding 20 times thicker than you do for plutonium, which is named after the devil. And so when you hear the word cesium, Never think of cesium, just think of plutonium, curium, uranium fission products, hot particles. Cesium is how they downplay it. Fukushima melted fuel is drifting in the ocean onto land and lacking containment. It ends up on the coastline, blows into the community, and people get an exceptional dose. And health harm will go on for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Of course, it'll go on long past the human experience. It's not just people get an exceptional dose. The insects and the birds and forest dwellers, all the incredible diversity, and the bacteria is actually exterminated. So the forests don't break down. When you have forest fires now, they're much more volatile because you didn't break down because most of the bacteria is being exterminated. And that means all the other species can't survive in that kind of environment, right? But all of these, I'm just trying to build you a scenario so you can appreciate the rest of the show. Not easy to understand nuclear, but that's my job, is to make it so you can wrap your mind around it in one go. Fears that marine life, Japan Times by the way, fear marine life is being poisoned by nuclear material flowing, not bleeding, not leaking, flowing or hemorrhaging. Experts warn of festering radioactive sore contaminating the food chain. So you expect to see emaciated birds and emaciated whales if that's true. Well, sadly, there's lots of emaciated. All of them are emaciated. TEPCO emits, there's nothing funny about it, that's the gallows laugh, by the way. TEPCO emits radioactive waters flowing into the Pacific. Fears of ocean contamination. Nuclear material is flowing to the ocean, a grave matter. Then the situation at Fukushima is deplorable. Well, it's only the homeless, the victims of society, the immigrants who don't speak the language, and victims of society mostly. Okay, so let me just run through the tanks. 2013, they had 1,000 tanks. 2013, 1,000 tanks. Well, how many tanks they got now, Dana? Well, 1,000 tanks. They're actually empty. That's a picture from 2013 of Reactor 4. That's all media you see there. Then the media made these videos saying they're at Reactor 4. But that's actually Reactor 4 over there when they made the videos. There's a lot of lying going on. And then the actual true story you'll find right here. That's what I do. I tell you it's not a nice thing, okay? There's nothing good. There's no glory in this. There's no bands playing when I show up anywhere. There's no people looking for autographs. There's no fan clubs. Nothing. I'm the most hated person on the planet right at this stage because I'm honest. I'm just trying to wake up the planet and have a conversation and come up with solutions. And that makes me a vicious criminal, apparently. Radioactive water still troubles the Japanese nuke plant. Now, Mari Yamaguchi should be, never mind, but she shouldn't be allowed to breathe the same air as us, let's put it that way. March the 10th, 2014. So the recap was 2013, 1,000 tanks. 2014, 1,200 tanks. 2017, they had 900 tanks, large tanks. 2019, this line right here, 1,000 tanks. And 2021, 1,000 tanks. So 1,000 tanks 2013, 1,200 2014, 900 in 2017, 1,000 2019, and 1,000 again in 2021. They're not filling up the tanks because if you fill up the tanks at 2.2 sieverts an hour per liter, 2 liters is a lethal dose, but the tanks will have 1.4 million sieverts, which means you can't actually build another tank on the site anywhere because you have to abandon the site because you have this big tank there that is pulsing 1.4 million sieverts. 4 to 5 being a lethal dose. 1.4 million is a lethal dose from a football field away or more. Okay. So the tanks are actually empty. It's all been hemorrhaging into the ocean. The tanks were built with bolts, and if you filled the tanks up, you had an earthquake, you would lose the site. So rather than tell you the truth, they built the tanks to trick you into thinking they didn't contaminate the ocean. And that story now for 3 years straight is the only story you're going to hear from this bizarre cult secret society as known as the nuclear industry, and the media and universities have all been captured by the industry, including the regulators. Okay, so this is a model of the Xenon 133 covering the northern hemisphere. Covers the entire Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, Europe, everything. A lot of that, of course, when it rains, runs down to the coastlines. It's a continuous plume. Notice it's a continuous plume. This is not like a plume that's drifting along the coastline. This covers the entire northern hemisphere. So if it was a snowstorm, imagine the entire northern hemisphere having a snowstorm sustained for years at a time. Well, that's what this is, except you can't see it or taste it or hear it or smell it or feel it or touch it or pick it up or throw rocks at it. But it's there, and the Geiger counter up there is proof that it's there. This is pulsing energy every second. 3 years for the contamination to reach the U.S. coast from Fukushima. Scientists, that's a dirty word, unfortunately. It's not all scientists' fault, but it certainly is if they didn't speak out about Fukushima. Okay, so 3 years. Well, this model is a 40-day model of just venting from the Fukushima nuclear meltdowns in Japan. And as you can see, it didn't take 3 years to reach the coastline. It covers the entire Pacific Ocean. And the headlines earlier, from the surface to the ocean floor, is also completely contaminated of radioactive fallout. This is why you're seeing the species die off. They're the harbinger, the canaries in the proverbial coal mines, right? This is Noah's model based on 40 days, only based on venting. Now, if you actually use the inventories that were lost, you would find, I'm being conservative. Government admits water pouring to the ocean at Fukushima is highly contaminated and going on for the last 2 years. Officials reveal it may have started just after the nuclear meltdown. It may have started. Well, first off, that's the building over there. There's nothing left. The reactor cores are gone, and on top of it was decades of reactor cores at these 190-foot buildings. 4 reactors are gone, and 4 fuel pools are gone. They had 40 years of inventory. So it covered the oceans. It doesn't float on the ocean. It's suspended from the surface to the ocean floor, and everything that lands on the ocean floor is brought back up in how the ocean rate circulates. So it normally brings up nutrition from the ocean floor to the surface to feed the phytoplankton, the basis of the food chain, the oxygen chain, the carbon sequestering chain. And that's why they were wiped out immediately, because they're in the most vulnerable position of the ocean. And then, so this is another model, and there's a study to your left of the radioactive fallout. 220 million atoms per liter of just iodine. You can see to the right how it just covers the oceans. Now, this model is just a short model. It doesn't run out for, it only runs for a couple of weeks, right? It doesn't run out long term. There's no way to stop Fukushima radioactive water going to the Pacific. It will continue for 20,000 to 30,000 years. And Gunderson lied to us about Reactor 4, right? He said these were real when it actually looks like that. So he was the cover-up guy meant to trick people. And so nuclear leak, which I showed you is not a leak, obviously, poisoned the Pacific. So we're talking about the Pacific Ocean. So it's not just Fukushima. Criticism will be worldwide. And the people of Japan are responsible for poisoning of the entire planet's food chain due to radioactive fallout. The buck has to stop somewhere. New York Times, ocean life faces a mass extinction. We may be on the precipice of a major extinction event, and obviously that's what's going on. So when insects and birds and mammals and animals and all the creatures and humans inhale radiation or consume it or drink it, it increases the exposure by a factor of 1 trillion because it's pulsing energy in every direction that's destroying the chromosomes, the cells. The cells can't replicate anymore. Destroys the DNA, and it sterilizes the insects, the female populations. We have to protect the females on this planet we have to protect them with our very lives now. Impossible to remove hundreds of radioactive materials, 1,200 radionuclides, because the filters, after a few minutes, are so radioactive you can never get near them again. You're not filtering oil for a car or water for your tap. You're filtering lethal doses by the liter. And so once that filter is turned on, you can never use the system again. Now, you can go back through my last couple of videos where I talk about the tanks and tunnels, and I show you that documentation. So it's complicated, but it's not if you go watch those videos. Mind-blowing die-off in the Pacific is far worse than anything we've ever seen before. Alarm over what's happening in the ocean. Never heard such a thing anywhere in the world. Beaches full of bodies, countless carcasses. 100% death rates of baby seals, starving, suffering from shortages of food, thin, all sorts of illnesses, infections. West Coast Seabird Die-Offs is the biggest ever recorded. The stomachs are completely empty, unheard of, and unprecedented in size and scope. And sickened animals, unlike anything doctors ever seen, they're eating themselves from the inside. Cancers, liver, pancreas, intestines are shutting down, infested with parasites and immune to antibiotics. Unprecedented catastrophe caused the loss of 200,000 sea lions. Journalists, nobody even talks about Fukushima anymore. There's almost no more fish. The ocean is dying. It's terrifying. The government warns the public to expect alarming increases in death on the West Coast, but also the Atlantic. See, they hid the fact that the Atlantic was devastated also. So we launched expeditions to Alaska and back down to Vancouver. All around Vancouver Island, there's 27,000 islands, and I would go for 4 to 5 months at a time and do species counts. In case you're wondering who I am and why I'm showing you all this documentation. We're almost to Egg Island up there. Seas are definitely building. Hang on there. Mark Lawrence is saying that organic slant got too mouthy with me, had to unsub. First off, organic slant doesn't get mouthy with anybody, ever. Under any circumstances. It doesn't block anybody either. And he debates you. He doesn't get mouthy. And so your version of mouthy was a debate that you couldn't handle, obviously. And so you shouldn't smear organic slant in my comments section. That's not acceptable. On with the video. You can unsub me and block me if you like. It's Monday, the 15th. fog is so thick you can't see a bloody thing. One of my tow lines is snapped. Still hanging on by but a big wave now between me and the skiff, and I'll break that one. That's the tow rope for the Zodiac. And see how the braid actually started to come undone, but stayed together. 4.3 miles per hour. Back and forth. 3.9 knots. 4.6 miles per hour, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. There's Covert Island. The bottom of it, we're inside, no ground swells now, or they're calming down. We got the Beak sail up. Then we got the mainsail up. I have to straighten up this one because it's taking some of the wind from the big one. Woo! So we're in behind Covert Island, got some shelter. It's 20 after 1 now. I dropped the spinnaker down a little bit, the pole, the whisker pole. We're getting 3.6 knots, 4 miles per hour. They're so pathetic, eh? The ocean current is actually real, and it takes about 45 days for the ocean current to carry radiation across the Atlantic to, or the Pacific to Canada, United States. So they originally came out and showed you the fake chart over there of the tsunami from NOAA, but NOAA actually had a radioactive dispersal from the ocean that they wouldn't show you. They hid that away from you. There was a Germany company come out with a model of that one right there.
Maybe worse than thought. Studies from last year indicate that radioactive water will contaminate the entire Pacific Ocean in just 6 years. Kim Min-ji reports.
This graphic shows the gradual contamination of the Pacific Ocean due to leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. The simulation, which was run by a German marine research institute, shows the entire Pacific waters being polluted by radioactive water in just 6 years.
Lawrence says, then block me then. And I said, you can block me and unsubscribe from me. But if you want, I can block you. Here, I'll block you. I'll block you so you don't have to worry about it happening to you later. Have a nice life. So the radioactive fallout is also airborne. It's also airborne. So the ocean, by the way, is covered in 45 days from just, if it was not airborne, it was just going to the ocean, it takes 45 days for the ocean currents to circulate around the entire Pacific. The jet streams do it in 7 days. And so as you can see, I covered 6 years, 6 expeditions. It was actually, I made 4 trips to Alaska in 1 year. Let me see now. So we've done all kinds of research expeditions. The species are actually gone for sure, as I'm going to show you here in a minute. So you can fill the beach up with people, but the species to your left are not going to come back. You're not going to find them. And I know because I went there and documented it year after year. The species are actually exterminated all the way to Alaska. And I took absurd beatings to get this documentation. We prayed for a recovery, but after 6 years, there was, species never came back. So the ocean was actually sterile. This is low tide. right by Alaska. We're about 10 miles away from Alaska border. There's an 18-foot tide exchange here. And I'm bringing Zoe into the beach to have a leak before we move down the west coast. And you can see the rocks there are actually naked. And what I mean by that is those rocks should be covered. To your right, you can see the stain where they used to be covered. All those rocks on the beaches you're looking at are underwater at high tide. So all the species to your left are permanently exterminated. You'll never take those pictures again. So the birds have nowhere to forage, right? And this is why the birds are dying of starvation everywhere. It's because they can't go to the beaches and get a feed anymore to subsidize the migratory krill, anchovies, sardines, the squids, and everything else. Because normally the birds can go in at low tide and have a smorgasbord, eat whatever they feel like, right? And there used to be 700 algae. There used to be 700 algae, and those algae had 6,500 well-known invertebrates and thousands of more unknown invertebrates without the backbones like little shrimps. They're permanently exterminated. So now the birds are going along the coastline, and the coastlines are empty. They no longer have this incredible diversity. So this is why you're seeing them emaciated, because there's no backup plan for the birds. Because normally the birds can follow the migratory, but if they ended up on the coastline, they can just eat as they go along. There was tons of food and creatures to forage on, right? So deteriorating plant threatens mass extinction around the world. And this is what we've seen play out 100% is an extinction event. We're currently on the East Coast, and we're seeing the same thing on the Atlantic Ocean. And so normally it looked like this, because it's all tropical rainforest where I was up there. So year after year, this is what I was doing, looking for species. And there was never anything easy about it. Okay, we're almost... We just got a bit more to go before we get into the recent news. Okay, the elephant in the room is Fukushima. Radiation when it comes to the Pacific Ocean die-off. And the government has failed to inform the public about the extent of the fallout. And there's no media silence, it's media complicity. It's captured media, captured universities, captured regulators, and captured key positions in the government. The industry is now firmly entrenched in all facets of resistance, and they have controlled opposition like Greenpeace and Arnie Gunnison and Helen Caldicott, and these people are controlled opposition, obviously, because they're not telling you the truth. So what else makes sense, right? Radioactive xenon-133 in Washington, the United States, at 450,000 times above detection levels. There was a study. Almost the entire ground level of the northern hemisphere was covered in radioactive fission products, which means the entire Pacific, entire Atlantic was covered in fission products, and there's a model of that there. So Fukushima fallout spiked the year after 3/11. And sources say about 1,000 kinds of radioactive material are released from the reactors. So when you hear cesium, that's an insult. That's them calling you stupid when you hear them talk about cesium. So 1,500 atoms of the sulfur peroxide hydrogen buckyballs per cubic meter of air detected. There was another study, separate study from that, showing that males were sequestering around 360 atoms of the sulfur peroxide hydrogen buckyballs from Fukushima every day in their testicles. That's going to be true for all the animals and mammals and birds and insects. And so this is why you see a population devastation and an omnicide apocalypse event. Nuclear engineer, I agree that Fukushima can be an extinction event. West Coast grey whale population. Now we're going to cover some headlines from the last couple of years, and then we'll jump into 2021 headlines. West Coast grey whale population plummeted by thousands. It's around 7,000 now. This story was 6,000, but it's actually, they increased it to 7,000 grey whales. Majority of them were emaciated, and some of these will float and get struck by ships because floating dead whales don't get out of the way. You have a minke whale unusual mortality events, 2017, 2019 is still ongoing, by the way. 2019 grey whale unusual mortality event. As I showed you, it's over 7,000 since 2016. Obviously, that's still active. 2016, 2019, endless stream of humpback whales, unusual mortality event, along the Atlantic coast, where I'm currently too. And majority of these are emaciated. In order for them to be emaciated, they travel 8,000 kilometers without getting food and then travel back, right? And now they went from 12 inches of blubber to 3 inches of blubber. North Atlantic right whale unusual mortality event is still active. We got some stories about that coming up. 260 dolphins dead in the Gulf since Mexico, or since February. That's 2019. That was declared an unusual mortality event. Alaska krill and mussels now a unusual mortality event. And 15 gray whales in that one period also. Now, here's how radiation works on humans. Irreversible heart damage for children with 50 becquerels a kilogram of fission products. Not just cesium-137. Every time I hear the word cesium-137, I want to vomit over a nuclear scientist. Oh, and animals will get smaller over the next century as they downsize to survive. No, that's what radioactive fallout does. We're seeing that now here on the East Coast where all the squid are small, all the capelin are small, all the birds now are small. 2 fishery officers tell me in the last month that this is the smallest squid ever recorded in history, and they were rolling on the beaches. Never seen before. Never heard tell of that before. Now remember this story? Bereaved mother orca finally drops the calf after carrying a corpse for an unprecedented 17 days. That was out in the Juan de Fuca Strait in British Columbia. I was up on the west coast by Alaska when that happened. And California sea lion is to be killed to preserve Oregon's salmon. Wrap your mind around that story. Because, if the solution to saving the fish is killing everything else that eats them, they're already long gone. Okay, so 337 whales beached is the largest stranding ever. I believe that was 2015, right? 2015, and they were the sea whales, SEI whales, are large bluish-gray baleen whales that filter the water and feed on krill and other small creatures, and the krills were dramatically impacted. Okay, so whales won't stop killing themselves in New Zealand. Now, 2018, people might remember that headline. What happened was, out of the blues, we started getting mass mortality event after mass mortality event after mass mortality event in New Zealand and Australia, right? New Zealand just experienced its largest whale stranding in decades. Oh, it was worse than decades. 600 pilot whales. And 200 were saved, was it? 450 whales stranded in Tasmania. That was a different one. And discovered a pod of 200 dead a few days after the first pod of 250 was discovered. Second pod was sighted by a helicopter, making it the worst stranding in Tasmania's history. And rescuers fighting to save a pod of 270 whales stranded have discovered 200 more whales 10 kilometers away. And they appear to be dead. And they were, of course, right? And brings the total number of dead whales on that day was 290, but it still increased to around 400, right? Now, previous to that, they were reporting, when the whales were mass mortality events, they were reporting that the whales were emaciated, the pilot whales. That's what they were actually reporting for the first couple of mass mortality events, that they had empty stomachs and had no blubber reserve whatsoever. 200 more pilot whales found as stranded on the coastline. Almost 500 pilot whales stranded in Australia island state. And then we have repeated, whales won't stop killing themselves in Australia over the last couple of years. Almost 400 die in Australia's worst stranding. 20,000 birds just starved to death off the Dutch coast. And they were all emaciated. They had no food in their stomachs whatsoever. And as grey whales starve, emaciated. What's killing the Pacific whales? Well, Fukushima has broken the food chain permanently. In the first 6 months of that year, 167 North Pacific grey whales, many of them emaciated, have washed up from Mexico to Alaska. And surging sick and hungry sea lions off California coast, malnourished, aka emaciated. And the puffins found starving to death in mass die-offs likely linked to climate change. And climate change, of course, is radioactive fallout. So it's hard to appreciate that when I say it. So let me show you a model of the radioactive fallout. Now, so you see my Geiger counter up there, that's recording energy, pulses every second of pure energy. And the radioactive atoms will do that for millions of years. It's going to pulse energy every second. That's Fukushima fallout. That's an invisible snowstorm pulsing energy in every direction every second for millions of years to go. So for 75 years straight, the planet has been heating up because of all the nuclear testing, all the nuclear dumping, all the nuclear accidents, all the nuclear waste and everything else released into the environment. And 75 years of fuel pools still splitting the atom. So you put the core in the reactor in a containment vessel, you fire it up, it starts splitting the atom, and that energy powers 1 million homes. But that doesn't stop. So they can only use it for around 18 months. Then they put it in a pool to cool down for a few decades. It still has the energy of 1 million homes, still splitting the atoms. That's soaked up by the water, and that's evaporated about 120,000 tons at a 440, or 120,000 liters at a 440 different pools. Each pool is about 120,000 liters of saturated water evaporated up, and that liberates those atoms, trillions per liter, into the environment. So the more reactor cores go into fuel pool, the more splitting atom, the more global warming. The only way to slow global warming down is to shut down all nuclear and deal with the fuel pools and the emissions. Everything is vented. All the cast on the nuclear sites, they're all vented, which means that's global warming in overdrive because it's still pulsing energy and it's still splitting the atom. It's a perpetual genocide machine. I had a nightmare one night that we found another planet like Earth, and the nuclear industry said, hey, let's bring a nuclear reactor there, which means you exterminate every species there too, see? So the puffins are starving because the food chain, all the anchovies and squid and sardines and krill and herring and mackerel and everything is being exterminated by Fukushima. Dead partly because of, like when you die of starvation, it's not partly, it's you died of starvation. You have no muscles left, you use up all the reserves. blah, 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 blah. Your stomachs are empty. The puffin's food supply has been disrupted by changes in air and sea temperature and ice levels. Now, all the ice, all the way to Alaska, the Cascades, the Rocky Mountains, all those glaciers are actually gone. You'll get snowfall in the winter, but that's not ice pack. The ice pack is gone because we've done the whole coastline year after year. So that cold water runs down to the coastline and regulates temperatures through the streams and the estuaries and raises the water levels in droughts so salmon and fish can get up and spawn, right? But without the ice melting each summer, spring, summer, and fall, the streams are not regulated. And that water goes down to the coastline, regulates the temperatures of the coastline from the glaciers. So that affects all the insects and bird population and trout. And that's an important habitat. That's an incredible biodiversity in these estuaries and lakes and marshes and rivers all the way up to the glaciers, the foothill of the glaciers. They're permanently gone. It'll take you 5,000 years to rebuild that after the radiation dissipates in a couple of million years. Climate change driving ghost moose calf mortality. Climate change, which is radioactive fallout. So over 150 whales found beached in Australia Bay. Few survived. That was 2019. Humans are sleepwalking into a mass extinction. No, they're not sleepwalking into it. They're being deceived and manipulated. Humans are good. The nuclear industry is bad. 5 giant dead whales all washed ashore near one another. See, these are like the odds of 2 dead whales washing up on the same beach is pre-Fukushima was you got better chances of getting hit by a Soviet satellite in 3, 2, 1. Oh my God, you're still there. I can't hear you. So to have 5 wash up on the same beach, these were emaciated. Unprecedented number of dead whales have washed up in Scotland and Ireland. They had 1,000 Covert beak whales washed up in different stages of decomposition. Now, the Covert beak whale, they dive a mile deep, stay down for over an hour. They'll come up to the surface, stay for 2 minutes, and go straight back down again. They do that all day. And the scum, degenerate UK media was claiming that they died from nitrogen narcosis. But whales don't get nitrogen narcosis. This is their environment. See, nitrogen narcosis is caused by breathing compressed air, right? And we use a regulator, a scuba diving regulator to compensate for the pressure. But that's why we do a decompression coming up. Whales don't do a decompression coming up. They're not breathing compressed air. But the media knew most people couldn't comprehend that, so they were claiming that they were being driven off the ocean floor by sonar, and then they were getting nitrogen narcosis. But what happened was they were all emaciated. They were actually emaciated. Whales won't stop killing themselves. So if you want to know something about me, this article is worth reading later. And this was written by the ex-editor of the Japanese Sunday Times, which is the animosity equivalent of the BBC or CBS or CBC here in Canada. And they gave me gag orders so I wouldn't point the fingers at some of the culprits that lasted for 3.5 years. And then I was vilified and demonized in the media. But I didn't do nothing wrong, so I didn't go away, obviously. Killer whales dying along the Pacific coast, very sick, very emaciated. Owls along the west coast, badly emaciated. Pelicans are starving, killing and eating their baby birds because they're emaciated. Mass death of sea lions and dolphins and birds. Caribou mortality very high. Giant whales found dead up and down the Pacific Northwest coast. Definitely a pulse of death. Continuing trends of whales washing ashore. Animals are sick, starving, emaciated. 0 babies survive on an island. For birds, and usually over 15,000. Now there was 0 babies surviving. Marine mammals all on the California coast are extremely emaciated. Carts filled with emaciated dead bodies. The Pacific Ocean is turning into a desert. Entire generations of baby sea lions emaciated. Babies being found severely emaciated, unusual mortality events. Largest animals on the earth found dead on the west coast, sick and very emaciated. Food supplies being killed off. Well, the only way it can be killed off was the radioactive fallout. Mind-blowing die-off of seabirds underway from Alaska to California. There was 1.4 million murres, common murres, and they dive 600 feet all day. They feed on anchovies and squid and sardines and krill and mackerel and herring and everything else. They showed up in absurd numbers. They estimated 1.4 million. The year before that was over 1 million Cassini auklets washed up on the beaches in the Pacific. They were all emaciated. Every bird we're seeing is starving. 100% death rates of baby seals. None survived, starving. Unprecedented die-off nearly endangered marine mammals. More have washed up in a few months than all of recorded history combined. Now the entire coast is being affected. Whole populations hit hard. Animals of all ages sick, not only newborns. Walking skeletons so hungry to eat the rocks. Now remember the pictures I showed you earlier from the expeditions where the rocks are naked. And in the side picture where pre-Fukushima, the rocks are covered with all kinds of creatures. So if seals got separated from their mothers and they got into the shoreline, they would just eat the rocks. Their bodies would digest the creatures on the rocks and they would excrete the rocks, like little small rocks, but they would cover it in all kinds of creatures. But there's nothing left there. So their natural reflex is to do that. We're almost there. 4 more to go. Countless dead birds reported in the Pacific off the U.S. coast. Nothing will eat the bodies. And that's another phenomenon where you see all these dead creatures washing up, but there's no birds there, no predators there eating them. Salmon covered in fungus, red lesions all over, beak gapping sores. Gray whales and 55 dolphins found dead on the west coast. Corpses of sea lions, birds, sea turtles. Rash of dead humpback whales and Oregons. You get the picture, I hope. Mysterious deadly black fungus being found on fish in the Pacific Northwest. I talked to lots of fishermen in the Pacific who was asking me about that. What the hell was going on with that? Did I think that might have had something to do with Fukushima? Yeah, of course it did. Because radiation kills the natural bacteria on their body that would keep those pathogens and viruses from manifesting, see? Like green starlights, highly contaminated marine snow covered the seafloor at least 2,000 kilometers. It was, as I showed you earlier, it was in the entire northern hemisphere. Like, we have to make a stand. It's the nuclear industry or 8 million species. Okay, so here we go. September the 10th, 3 days ago, 25-meter endangered blue whale washes ashore on a beach south of Halifax. South of Halifax. And no signs of external injuries. They're always looking for some excuse, blaming on you or your tin cans or your pop bottles or your cardboard. He said that this is only the third blue whale to wash up a Nova Scotia shore in the last 4 years. Only. It's quite an interesting way of framing a narrative. Major risk factors for the species include dwindling food supply. Major risk factor is starvation. And severe weather brought on by climate change. Look, whales live in severe weather. It's the Atlantic Ocean, for goodness sakes. That's their environment. See, like, as I got 14,000 hours underwater. I would dive in 50, 60, 70 mile-an-hour winds if I had shelter. Because once I get down the height of the waves underwater, it's perfectly calm. It's always the same. It'll be a raging storm up there, beautiful down below. That's how it actually works in the real world. I used to do 6 hours a day on the ocean floor, 300 days a year. So that whale is emaciated. That's an emaciated blue whale, folks. And they got the usual suspects and useful idiots. The Gnome Nuggets is reporting several migratory seabird species. Now, the migratory bird run goes all the way up to November the 15th. We got to get back out on the ocean. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned it last week, but we ordered in an oil sensor for the outboard, for the Beak engine, and it's the wrong one. It's just torture. It had been blowing. We had a hurricane here on the weekend, blew 180 kilometers. I'll talk about that at the end. Auklets, murres, shearwaters. And over the last several years, though, the bird colonies on the islands have been shrinking, and nobody's been able to determine why. Because the coastlines are stripped is why, obviously. They're literally seeing fewer birds on the cliff, and they're watching the birds fade away every year, which is what we're doing. I'm doing the same thing, but I'm not them, so the media's not going to report on what I document. The media's only going to report on these people for some reason. They're literally seeing fewer birds on the cliff, and they're watching the birds fade away every year. Alaska Sea Grant Marine Advisory Program agent Gay Sheffield, based at the UAF's Northwest Campus in Nome. Holy goodness, you must feel important. Why are birds not in the best of health, and why are they dying? Across the region, dead seabirds have been washing up on the shores in large numbers for several years, and the problem seems to be getting worse. And starting in 2017, actually started before it, as I showed you earlier, the northern Bering Sea has been experiencing Seabird Die-Offs. Multi-species adults have been washing in dead, and includes a variety of different types of birds, typically with shearwaters and murres and puffins and gulls and kittiwakes. This year they actually had cormorants and loons, really. And loons are the apex predator of birds, right? They eat like 1,000 pounds of fish a year. It's not normal. In addition to local subsistence hunter and beachgoers finding dead birds in regional shores, the National Park Service has recently conducted a survey of the Bering Land Bridge Preserve to study the seabird die-off in the region. And according to the reporting from KNOM, they found upwards of 100 dead birds every 4 kilometers on some parts of the area. Every 4 kilometers, you're finding 100 dead birds. I went out a couple of weeks ago, found 5 dead birds. One of them had a tumor for a head, right? I've done a video about that, and it's still on my site here. My new site. They just took down my other site with 24,000 subscribers and 1,600 presentations. While I was on a research expedition 450 kilometers in the woods counting insects. There's no ants, there's no spiders in the woods whatsoever. None. No spiders in the woods. There's no fish jumping in the ponds. I checked several hundred ponds. There was no flocks of birds flying. It's just absurd. And then they took down my site and put me out of business. I had to start up this site and try to rebuild my subscription base. Researchers and scientists, including Sheffield, theories about the seabird die-offs, known as wrecks in the scientific community, speculating disease, toxic algae blooms, and see, when you're talking speculating, I don't speculate, I provide the documentation. It's food source scarcity caused by the Fukushima radioactive fallout. Food source scarcity. What a coward way to frame that narrative. Since 2017, though, the majority of the dead seabirds have been one thing in common. It was before that, by the way. Regardless of the species, regardless of the year, the birds have been documented in poor body conditions, meaning they're thin, Scumbag Sheffield said. Scumbag Sheffield explains, there are things that could make a bird thin. One is it sick with something? Did it go out and get on to the bar last night and get drunk and come home hungover and can't eat? So it doesn't feel good? It doesn't have the strength to go eat? Who the hell talks like that? What kind of lunatic talks like that, by the way? The second would be, is it being poisoned? Yeah, poisoned by Fukushima. So it doesn't feel good, so it's not going to starve. So it's going to starve. So the radiation gets in the bird's body. Then from bioaccumulation and everything else, saturated in the environment. So what happens? Well, the bird starts producing all these white blood cells. They displace the red blood cells, carrying oxygen and nutrition throughout its body. It's too weak to fly, becomes lethargic. It has leukemia, and now it dies because it has no oxygen. So it starves to death, and then it doesn't take long to starve to death, just a few days, and then it dies. Third is it have trouble finding its food, says Scumbag Sheffield. Of course it does, because there's none out there. We sent off numerous carcasses to the nuclear apologist, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, to see what the cause is. All you got to do is open up and you see that it's emaciated. We asked, why are they starving? And is it possible they've been exposed to harmful algae blooms or toxins in the oceans? Is it possible they've been exposed to Fukushima radiation like everything else? Is what you should be asking. It's revolting they do that. It was 2011, which is when Fukushima happened, and we were already getting reports of Seabird Die-Off. Yeah, there was a big pulse, a death pulse in 2011, because the original plumes were lethal for a species. Early on, it was mostly murres and shearwaters, and time went on, the murres were still dying. Common murres, there was over 1.4 million of them, died in just 1 year, 2016 alone. We were beginning to getting more reports of puffins. Now, in occulus, remember the puffins in 2014, they were calling that an extinction event because they had found around 400 dead puffins in one area. So they declared that almost an extinction event for puffins. I used to cover it all the time back then. And it appears to be all seabirds are taking the hit. So the only thing that could really be a catalyst for all of that would be radioactive fallout. Like when you see all the movies and you read all the stories about how a nuclear war will cause an extinction of the planet, and the sun will be blocked out, and blah, 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 and nothing will grow, right? It doesn't act, there was 2 people who wrote that study, and all the media in Hollywood jumped on it, and that's been the go-to ever since. It's a total fable. How it actually works, now I'll tell you why it's a fable, because we had nuclear wars. It's called nuclear testing. And so Castle Bravo was equal to 1,000 Hiroshima 15 kiloton nuclear weapons going off at the one time. 1,000. So it's equal to China and Russia firing 500 nuclear missiles each at each other. But then the Soviet Union's Tesla bomba, was equal to 3,800 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. So that's equal to India and Pakistan firing 1,900 nuclear weapons at each other. So are they not nuclear wars? Would that not be a nuclear war if Russia and China, or Russia and somebody else, or somebody else and somebody else fired 500 nuclear bombs at each other? The sun didn't disappear, but that was the event that started the catalyst. But Fukushima, see, a nuclear weapon goes off, it's 1/1,000,000th of a second. Multiple nuclear meltdowns with decades of reactor cores is the constant emissions. It's a constant emission. Let me show you what it looks like just to reaffirm that for you. As I speed it up, let me speed that up to 200%. I'll put that on the big screen. Now that's Hawaii right here. Watch when it circles Hawaii and breaks away for a second. You see where it splits the plume. Watch how the modeling works. So it's a continuous plume. that this is just a few days into it. Look at this. This is just day 10 after the nuclear meltdowns. Day 12, or day 12 there after the nuclear meltdowns. The whole Pacific Ocean is now saturated with radioactive fallout. So all the birds, all the fish, all the animals now are being exterminated after an event. This is a pulse. But you can see all of the northern hemisphere is covered. Every time it rains, a lot of that will wash down to the coastlines, which is the nursery of the Pacific Ocean. So birds would normally fly along the coastline if they can't find their migratory krill and sardines and anchovies and herring and squid and everything else. They would just duck into the coastline and get a smorgasbord. But they can't do that. As the research expeditions show, that was wiped out, right? There's very little fat, very little meat on the birds, with the breastbones showing. So why would you send it away? When the USGS Wildlife Health Center conducted necropsies of those birds, they declared the cause of the death emaciation. Florida wild coral rescued from disease spent, now this is a crazy story, 2,200 coral. The Florida Rescue Center in Orlando is rearing the largest collection of Florida coral brought in from the wild from just ahead of a fast-moving plague along the state's southeast coast and the Keys. A batch of 22 corals, each more or less the size of a football, was sent to Sea Life. They split them up in all kinds of aquariums so that way they couldn't all be in all your eggs in the same basket. In a hasty, unprecedented, all hands on deck response to prevent coral extinction, 2,000 species are under care at 22 aquarium in 14 states now for over a year. Wow. So they're being exterminated. I'm trying to drink quietly so you don't hear me slurping. But my microphone is active. I'm not using a suppressor. I didn't like it because it would cut in and cut out, and that really bugged me and everybody else, I think. So 2,000 species, because you weren't allowed to do that, see? You weren't allowed to collect coral, right? But because they're going extinct, they collected them, split them up amongst 14 states. So it's less likely there'll be mass die-off of them on land. To set the stage for the next phase, a massive breeding program, but you can't put them back in the population if the environment is not safe, right? And the environment is never going to restore itself. We're not even trying to stop Fukushima. And the first 3 years, the tanks, the water filtration system, we know for a fact, because I covered it a few shows ago, the headlines from them was it wasn't used. It was taken out of service immediately. It was too contaminated to go close to. The Adventure Aquarium recently built another large tank with the recent shipment, became a major repository of coral from Florida. And so what they're saying is this is an extinction event for coral. So they went all hands on deck, unprecedented, and started getting as many corals out of the ocean as you could before they disappeared. The stony coral tissue loss disease. Now, they just make it up as they go along, obviously. Hang on. Yeah, they always come in two, right? So they treated it with antibiotics, has shown promise, but it's not clear if the treatments are targeting the cause of the disease or secondary infections. No, the cause of the disease is radiation. It strips them of their bacteria, and they're more susceptible to pathogens and viruses, okay? All right. I'm only going to tell you 500 more times. Scientists also suspect the corals are weakened by waters warming up with climate change. Honey, how come you're late getting home? Climate change. Oh, it's okay, honey. I'll do the dishes tonight. You're warning from climate change. Police officer pulls you over. How come you're speeding? You know, climate change. Of course, I should have known that. You have a nice day, sir. There's no more police officers for the next 50 kilometers. Go ahead and speed all you want. We actually had police do that to me when I was going to dive up by Alaska. I was heading from Vancouver to Prince Rupert to catch the boat to head up. And it was winter time, right? And the back of the truck was full of dive gear. And police pulled me over up by Williams Lake. And he looked at all the dive gear in the back of the truck, and there's snow everywhere. And he says, "You going diving in the winter?" Yeah. He said, "Where to?" I said, "We're heading for Alaska." He said, "Well, there's no more police on the road tonight." He said, "Just be careful out there." Because I was flying, I was doing about 130. I had a big truck back then. Temperatures above the threshold are linked to coral distress such as bleaching and disease proliferation. That's not an answer. The temperature is caused by the ocean being saturated with radiation, pulse, and energy every second. All it's going to do is heat up. If you don't stop Fukushima, there is no hope for any species. Like, you're going to have, at some point, this planet is going to stop nuclear in its tracks. At some point, you're going to have to do it. We should have done this 75 years ago. If the world was aware, like they were aware 75 years ago, if you go look up the 50s and the 60s and public videos about radiation fallout shelters, go watch a half a dozen of them. Radioactive fallout shelter. They're going to tell you some lies but they'll teach you about radiation, why you need a fallout shelter. Because once you're exposed, that's game over. Your cells stop splitting. So that's true for animals, mammals, and insects, and birds, and bacteria. Temperatures above the threshold are linked to coral distress such as bleaching and disease. That's radioactive fallout, unfortunately. Corals were taken from the wild from 2018 through early last year, and further collections are anticipated if corals manage to recover at reefs decimated by the disease. Right? They said the same thing about the starfish wasting disease, but when you read the study, there was no such thing. That was just a name they gave it, and they couldn't prove there was a disease. They couldn't, so normally they got all kinds of microscopes, and if they can't identify it themselves, they put the picture of the disease, the microscopic picture, up online for other scientists to work out what it is, right? They don't do that with the ocean for some reason. They do it with Ebola. They do it with hemorrhagic fevers. They do it with stuff like that, but they don't do it for some reason. A comprehensive plan for what to do with the rescued corals is still a work in progress, as scientists wait for signs that the stony coral tissue loss disease is waning. So all of a sudden, this one disease is wiping out all species. No species have a immunity to it, is what they're claiming. And so they make it up rather than talk about Fukushima. They can't report and can't blame it on Fukushima. That'll end the nuclear industry. And then maybe people will question why they're murdering their loved ones in the hospital with radiations at the same time, hopefully. There's a 3% efficiency of chemotherapy. And then the studies are asking, why are we using chemo when it's only 3% effective? By the way, 3% is the typical misdiagnosis for cancer. Nearly 2,000 corals are under the care of 22 aquariums in 14 states. And the state's worst mass die-off of Manatee, which has been triggered by an ecosystem collapse along the state's east coast. Ecosystem collapse. They're just making it up because they can't talk about radiation. They refuse to acknowledge radiation has some bad attributes. The coral disease inflicted a death rate of 80% of the affected reefs, and surviving coral tends to be small and young, which means the genetic superior selection is exterminated already. It's killed the corals that were large, older, in decades or hundreds of years, and those are the ones that reproduce the most. These were the genetic superior selection. We're trying to space them out so we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket. In other words, They know they can't reseed the ocean. You can't reseed the ocean without identifying it. And why not put it under the microscope and have pictures of it? What's the point of a microscope if you're not going to utilize it in that kind of environment? Oh, by the way, story was produced in partnership with the Flora Climate Reporting Network, Climate and Climate Change Network. So they got to blame it on climate change, right? Because it's funded by the Climate Reporting Network. Get it? Lunatics, boy. Warming Atlantic Ocean drives right whales to extinction. This is down by me. I should be out there right now on a boat, and we just had a hurricane pass through here in the Atlantic. And warming oceans have driven a critically endangered North Atlantic right whale population with traditional and protected habitat and exposing the animal to lethal ship strikes. Well, like animals, these animals are not stupid, okay? The ship strikes are the dead animals. Disastrous commercial fishing entanglement. Now, I went up in January this year, up by Stephenville. There was 15 pilot whales washed ashore 36 days before that. They were emaciated, but it also meant that meant about 150 died. You only find about 10% of the whales, right? So finding 15 meant 150 died. They were still washed up on the beach. They were right up alongside of the road. Fisheries wouldn't touch them. Oh, and somebody went there and cut the thyroid out of them. But, the locals were viciously upset. They were thrilled to see me show up. And they said to me, if those whales, one of those whales had a lobster pot rope wrapped around his tail, every media on the planet would have descended on our little community and would have demonized us every day for the next 10 years. But because they had no ship strike, no marks on their bodies, no ropes, nobody reported it for 36 days. And there was just this little blurb. And what did I do? I headed up the next morning, 800 kilometers away, to verify it. And to my horror, they were all emaciated. And in fact, a lot of whales were washed up right on the highway. And so the school children wouldn't go to school anymore because they were having nightmares. Because they had to drive past the dead whales on the way to school and drive past the dead whales on the way home at the end of the day in the fall where the sun sets early. And they couldn't sleep because they were having nightmares of dead whales chasing them. So the community got together with the RVs, because there's a big beach, rocky beach area, and towed the whales back down to the ocean where they washed back up down the coastline. They took me down there, right? But they took down my site, so I can't direct you to the videos, because being honest is a crime, apparently. Disastrous commercial fishery entanglement, and there's less fishery going on than there was 10 years ago by far, and greatly reduced calving rates. And most of the warming in the Gulf of Maine is not coming from the atmosphere or ocean surfaces, as one may think. Think of that statement. Most of the warming in the Gulf of Maine is not coming from the atmosphere or ocean surface. Why would you say something like that? Why would you try to frame that like that? I've never seen him frame it that way before. As one may think. As one may think. No, the ocean is saturated with radiation, as I showed you earlier. It's pulsing energy every second. The entire ocean, from the surface to the ocean floor, that's going to go on for tens of thousands or millions of years. It is coming from invading slope water, many hundreds of feet below the ocean surface, forcing the right whale to abandon their traditional habitat. Like, what's the catalyst for something like that, even if that was true? Why would the ocean change? It's because the ocean is full of radiation, pulsing energy every second, heating up. That's how that works. since 2010, the year before Fukushima. I love it. They won't do 2011, 2012 because it's easy now to assume Fukushima. The calving rate declined and the right whale population dropped by an estimated 26% in the last 11 years since Fukushima, according to the paper. And at the beginning of the decade, the North Atlantic right whale population had numbers over 500. Now there's 356, and most of them are in my back door in the St. Lawrence, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, due to a warming climate. A warming climate. As I showed you earlier, that's radioactive fallout. Circulation is slowing down, causing the Gulf Stream to move north, injecting warmer and saltier slope water into the Gulf of Maine, but he claims. And it reduced the abundance of crustaceans and copepods and phytoplankton, which is phytoplankton. The reduced right whale calving rates and forced the whales to abandon their midsummer feeding ground. That's because they're emaciated, and they came up here into the Gulf, and then all the radiation from central Canada washes down through the Gulf. So they got to get out of there. Instead, the whales have headed north to cooler waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But the Gulf of St. Lawrence don't produce cool water. It's the Labrador current that comes around the inside of Newfoundland on the Quebec side, that into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, that produces the cold water. So how come they're not going to Labrador? That's the question. The unusual mortality event declared by NOAA in 2017 is because they're emaciated. We covered this over and over and over. When 17 right whale deaths were confirmed, mostly in my back door right here, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And 10 right whales were found dead in 2019, and 2020-21, 4 deaths have occurred thus far. That's because the majority of them were here died. Funding for this research was provided by the Lenfest Ocean Program. Funding. So the narrative for this research was provided by Lenfest as a grant-making program, wrap your mind around this, that funds scientific research on policy-relevant topics. Wow. That's the industry covering up Fukushima and the world's oceans, and communicates the results of the supported research to detect decision makers and other interested audiences. For more than a decade, so they're new. Research stays focused, I'll put it on the big screen for you, on policy-relevant questions and approaches, and can adjust to any shifts in the policy landscape. Policy. And congruently, decision makers are able to respond to scientific results as they emerge. Through our work, we have become internationally recognized leaders in a range of practices that enhance the usability, relevance, and dissemination of scientific research. In other words, they're controlling the narrative. And they got a YouTube channel with 163 subscribers, and they've been there since 2011. And that's the latest video, was 2 months ago. I'm going to watch that tonight or tomorrow. Well, it won't be tomorrow, and I'll explain why coming up at the end of the show. But bloodbath scenes at the UK beach as 3 whales die on the shoreline. 3 beaked whales, the Sotheby beaked whales. And Galloway's on Tuesday. They're emaciated, by the way. You can tell how skinny they actually are. It was too late for the marine creatures. They died a short time later. The United Kingdom media is just, my God, boy. All of them should be put into a psychiatric unit with a drip in their arm. And, the receiver of wreck was notified, which means because the Queen owns the dead whale's carcass. That's owned by the Queen. The receiver of wreck is the Queen, right? Well, the British Divers Marine Life Rescue attendant, and the British Divers Marine Life Rescue is meant so the population don't go near the animal. They say, oh, you can't go near it. The whale's got diseases. And they want to vomit from it because it's worth $1 million to them, right? Make perfumes out of it and stuff like that. They're the only people on the planet that does that. Where, oh, you can't go near it. It might give you a disease. And it's a crime to touch a whale. It belongs to the Queen. What a strange, strange, strange country, man. You're just I love the British and the United Kingdom people, but they're treated worse than slaves. Orca, another southern resident killer whale, is in trouble. Right, there was like a 3-year period when no babies survived whatsoever. Just a few weeks after the presumed death of the southern resident killer whale K21, these whales can live to be 60 years old. K21 was around 30, and it was emaciated. Another resident orca is reported to be in bad shape. That one's 2 years old. It's emaciated. 2-year-old J-pod orca calf in poor condition. The 2-year-old southern resident orca declining condition was reported in the state by science nonprofit Sea Life Response, Rehabilitation and Research, the SR3. These groups are the industry, right? This is the controlled opposition. They're going to blame it on your tin cans. The group is contracted to monitor the conditions of the southern resident. So this is the industry. It creates a company because they got insider family and they're able to get the contract, right? But regardless, the whale showed us that her body condition was worse. She was measured her to be thin, and notice her skin had a paler color. She's emaciated. The 2-year-old baby is emaciated. Oh, and like you got to read this to wrap your mind around. Whales in poor body conditions are 2 to 3 times greater risk of dying than healthy whales. So emaciated whales are 2 to 3 times more likely to die than a healthy whale. That's an actual study, because I covered that in the last Die-Off a few weeks ago. I told that to my sister, and she blew up laughing. She said, my God, the world is stupid as a rock. Whales in poor body condition, emaciated whales are 2 to 3 times more likely, 2 to 3 times more likely to die. We can categorize her conditions as poor, which confers a significantly elevated risk of death the coming months. Not poor, she's emaciated. Like they're saying that if the orcas can't get salmon, they go on a hunger strike. They won't eat seals or sea lions or halibuts or octopus or anything else. No, not doing it. We're only eating that one type of salmon. If no sockeye salmon, we're going on a food strike. No, they ate so much radioactive food, they can't uptake any nutrition anymore because their body is saturated with radiation and they're only producing white blood cells. Oh, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. Should have known they were at it. Southern resident orca near Washington State presumed dead. That's the one they were talking about. And the one that Fukushima, body in poor condition, emaciated, with a collapsed dorsal fin. Emaciated. Emaciated because they're saturated with radiation. Can insects be a potential food source in times of climate change? Almost every story is blaming everything, no matter what you're talking about, is climate change. Don't matter what you're talking about. You didn't win the lottery, climate change. Everything is climate change. Well, you can't get a grant unless you're going to blame it on climate change, right? I was talking to a researcher out on the trail who was doing a vacation ATV with his family across Newfoundland. He was researching why the same thing. Where are all the spiders in Nova Scotia, basically? They're gone, and they're only on this one type of tree. They were on the trunk of the tree, but they weren't on the branches. They weren't making webs on the, like you would expect, right from the tips, because the trees suck up radiation. They're pulsing energy every second. And it's the same thing here, where I said, like, when I told him, he asked me what I was doing, I said I was looking for spiders. And he said, that's really interesting. He said, what are you doing that for? I said, well, because they're gone. I'm a researcher, I can't find them. I was I wasn't 450 kilometers away from here. It was a couple hundred kilometers from here on the expedition, right, this year. And we ended up having to pull the plug on it because they took down my site. Insects are also beneficial for the environment because they're low carbon and methane gas emissions. Like, that made me sick when I read that. Because of low carbon and methane gas emissions. So this is one of the things, you're trying to blame climate change and methane gases like cows farting and everything. They have no shame at all, do they, boy? No shame at all. He's from Zimbabwe. He wants to feed all the slaves insects. Green eating insects is now considered green. Green. They take over, everything that's good comes along, they take over and destroy it. Green eating is increasingly being promoted as a means of combating climate change. I just like that word, climate change, is radioactive fallout. If you're not familiar with that, hang on, I'll show it to you. This is really straightforward. This is not rocket scientists. I'm not nuclear scientists. So the model to your left is radioactive fallout from Japan. I'm going to speed it up if it's not. Yeah, I'm going to speed it up 200%. So now it's speeded up 200% of the model based on 40 days. And so it's only 137. Not all the other fission products, and this is just a tiny fraction of what's going to be in the plume. The plume is only cesium-137. It's only venting. But that's pulsing energy every second. And that's going to continue. That's been going on for 75 years. This one's been going on for 10 years. So it's an invisible snowstorm, pulsing energy every second. That's climate change. It's called radioactive fallout. We've seen the same thing but see, Fukushima, a nuclear meltdown is different because it does that. Whereas a nuclear weapon produces a big plume and it floats all over the place and slowly spreads out, this covers the whole planet in a continuous plume. It's still coming out of there. Just because the model stopped don't mean Fukushima stopped. The Swedish University Agricultural Science for Food Security program to promote insect-based meals. Promoting, and again, combating climate change. You want to combat climate change? You got to get rid of all nuclear. You got to come up with a repository to stop the fuel pools from emitting radiation into the environment. This is not a game. You better do it, and at some point you will, but you got to do it now. We got to do it now. And like, all the victims that go to the hospital, chemo patients and stuff like that, they're excreting. Their chemo patients are kept in a special room because they're so radioactive. They're pulsing so much radiation, they can radiate people in the hallways. These are $1 million rooms that are lined with lead and other things to keep the radiation from penetrating into the hallways. Right, so you're not supposed to cremate chemo patients because now the crematorium becomes radioactive and the community becomes radioactive. You can't cure someone with radiation. This is obvious. If they cured someone with radiation, or a dog or an animal, they would put it on a glass transport truck and take it to every school on the planet. We cured it with radiation. I've been at this for years, long before Fukushima happened. Radiation is not a cure. You got to sign a piece of paper. No two chemotherapy treatments are the same. They're like terracotta soldiers. One thing they all got in common, though, is they kill you. Street lights, especially super bright LEDs, may harm insect populations. Okay, let's say that's true. Because the story is trying to utilize that as the catalyst for why insects globally are disappearing. But only a tiny fraction of land is lit up by lights. I went out in 450 kilometers into the woods this year. There is no street lights out there. You get what I'm saying? I go out in these places so they can't say, oh, there's all kinds of pesticides and blah, 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 blah. I go out into Mother Nature and I stay out there. There's no insects out there. Is it because of lights or is it because of something else? So when you see this, the idea of that is to blame to the people that read it will say, honey, there's no insects in the garden because there's street lights all over the place. This is what that's all about. Street lights could be. It could be the Spider-Man whose radioactive spit right there and the radiation is killing all the insects, right? Or the Hulk took a pee right there and his pee is radiating all the insects. Maybe that's what it is. It could be. Dead wood in the global carbon cycle. The importance of insects in the decomposition of wood. So not only the problem with the reason the forests are getting these brutal forest fires, which by the way sequester the radiation. When you have a forest fire, you liberate the radiation back into the environment because you can't destroy radiation. And so normally the bacteria, you need the bacteria on the wood for the insects to be, for it to be a habitable area for insects to help decompose, to break down the wood, right? But if there's no bacteria because of radiation, then the insects can't stay there. And when you have a sustained radioactive fallout through all the forests, it stays, the whole ocean, the forest, so this is a tree leaf on the ground right here and another branch right here. They're both infected with radiation. They're pulsing energy at the speed of light, by the way. Well, almost the speed of light. The gamma, alpha, neutrons, is all betas, all pulsing energy at the speed of light almost. Those pulses, they hit each other. They change direction. It's called a Bromson-Lung effect. It's a German word. I probably butchered it. But it's a braking effect. So at the speed of light, they hit each other at the speed of light and they change direction. It's called braking. But what it does is it creates this X-ray effect. And that sterilizes that whole habitat. And so if the whole forest is saturated, and it is, with the radioactive fallout, then you exterminate all the creatures in increments over a decade, no problem at all. They're exterminated. There's no creatures there to break down the trees, see? So when you see these studies, and then global carbon cycle, because they're blaming carbon again on global warming, but the global warming is actually caused by the radioactive fallout pulsing energy every second, as I repeatedly showed throughout the presentation tonight. I got to get it in the second gear here. It depends on the climate. I'm not going to do it to you. I already done it to you tonight. Climate change, contributing to the decline in North Atlantic right whales. New studies suggest, could be, maybe. Warming waters are driving whales to areas where they're more vulnerable to vessel strikes and entanglements. Climate change, warming ocean temperatures. Could be. Right, you see what they're doing? The whales could be found feeding on tiny crustaceans like plankton, a common food source in the traditional feeding waters, but that was wiped out by Fukushima. And so the whales are emaciated. And so they're saying they're moving somewhere else. They're not. They're dead. 34 dead, a.k.a. stranded, a.k.a. dead, whales have been found in Canadian and U.S. waters since 2017. And then, of course, they got to blame it on the vessels. Whales don't die of anything now, only vessel strikes, apparently, in the last 3 years. Dead humpback whale washes ashore in Point Reeves, cause of death unknown. When a whale washes ashore, we humans tend to wonder or even assume that somehow we might be to blame. Really? Was the cause environment, a ship strike, a loose piece of fisherman's netting? Scientists have no evidence that those might have caused the death, though. But you got to throw it out there. You can't get a job unless you do that, see? This was the first dead humpback whale in the region since January, and the 15th dead grey whale, and one pygmy sperm. 4 of those died from ship strikes, and the rest of them, their deaths are undetermined, but they were all emaciated because we covered them right here. 15 dead grey whales, they're all emaciated, every one of them. Even the ones that allegedly got hit by a ship. This was no studies linking climate change. And if it doesn't, you're not getting any funding. So you better link it. You're not getting no funding. In fact, the researcher that I talked to on the expedition this year from Nova Scotia, who said there's no spiders up there, they blamed it on climate change, right? I explained to him what climate change was, whether that matters or not. He got it, though. Collapse of the North Atlantic right whale population. It's the collapse of all the species I showed you at the beginning. There's mortality events for many, many species, not just right whales. And so it's over right there. I'm over right here. We're seeing the same thing as we've seen on the West Coast. It's an extinction event. On the hunt for their food. In other words, they're starving. And so they're claiming that the food is moved somewhere else. No. It's extinct. Like you hear this all the time. Well, the fish moved away because of climate change, Dana. No, it doesn't work that way. That's their habitat, stupid. But see, the average person's not aware of that, right? You get sick of it, but nothing I can do about it. You got to tell the story. Because that's where the food is. In other words, you can see there that whale is emaciated. Anybody with a good eye can tell. Watch his tail. That's emaciated. They're big whales too, by the way, right? And they look 25% bigger underwater. So water temperature plays a big part because cold water is conductive for plankton. And plankton is the basis of the food chain, the oxygen chain, the carbon sequestration chain. It was wiped out right away. Black vultures' attack on animals may be increasing. There's some says it is, some says it's not. But it appears to be so. I'm not going to read it to you. Pretty gruesome. It's pretty gruesome. Some speculate in climate change. You can't even die on this planet unless you die of climate change, by the way. So 500 to 600 cows a year. Now, they say that these birds don't kill animals. They eat dead animals. So it's just unheard of for them to actually kill animals. Well, they're not finding any carcasses in the wild, see? Because they've been exterminated. So they got to go after the live ones. Oh, and your vehicles. Purple urchin slayers are trying to save the Pacific kelp forest. Now, I used to pick 20,000 urchins, red urchins a day. I used to do green urchins, and sea cucumbers, and gooey ducks, and razorback clams. I used to do 6 hours a day, 7 days a week on the ocean floor, up to 300 days a year. Leafy sanctuaries were left devastated by a predatory imbalance. Oh, and human meddling. So what they're trying to do is blame the purple urchin for eating all the kelp. But as I showed on the expeditions, that was wiped. The kelp forests were wiped out. What they're saying is that the purple urchins are eating the base of the kelp stems. Now, it's supposed to be 700 algae, not just the bull kelp. And therefore, it floats away, right? And now it's no longer a carbon sink. But it doesn't work that way because I was a diver. What the urchins do is they crawl up. All of them will crawl up the kelp and they'll weigh it down. And then the other will climb on top of it and then they eat it. What's happening, because now not only that, a diver is limited. So they also try to blame it on the divers were picking the red urchins, and therefore the purple urchins now had free reign. But it doesn't work that way either. The divers were only picking the 3-inch and the 3.5-inch. Not the 4-inch, not the 2 3/4 inch, but the 3-inch and the 3.5-inch only. Which is just a fraction of whatever population you're going to find down there. So by saying that it was the territory was decimated because the divers were picking all the red urchins. That's simply not the way it works. It's because I dove that industry for many years, right? That's what I told you is how it works. We only picked the 3-inch to the 3.5-inch. We left everything else as it was. And you couldn't notice that we picked the 3-inch because you're always moving. And I've done both tanks and compressed air, hookah diving, where you got an air hose with you the whole time. You can stay down until your kidneys can't take it anymore. 6 hours is your max anyway, but we've done it 7 days a week. The red urchins, which dwell in underwater kelp forests, has gotten harder to find in recent years. They were wiped out, basically. I'm not going to go down to that one. Manatees died in droves. This is 2013. And the deaths of pelicans, turtles, dolphins are also increasing. Scientists fear this is the beginning of a devastating eco-collapse, which is a segue to this story. 4 years ago, manatees were declared no longer in danger. Now they're dying at a record pace. And because I'm very, very, very familiar with seagrass, extremely familiar with it. And I reported on that each year when I went to Alaska on research expeditions on the ocean. And this is symmetrical. The story basically admits this is symmetrical throughout the entire ocean, not just this little area. And so there's over 800 died, and they're eating their own fat reserves. What's happening, though, is they're bioaccumulated so much radiation, they have so many white blood cells, they can't eat anything. They can't hold anything down. They got leukemia. 937 manatees have died in Florida, double the 5-year annual average, only 9 months into the year. Well, that wasn't an average pre-Fukushima. That's only average post-Fukushima. Lots of seagrass. Now, they eat other grasses too, not just seagrass. The manatees' preferred food. So, like, the way they do it, and that's where the red, this is all the colors there signifies where they're finding them dead. So symmetrical throughout that whole area. Multiple mortality events. In 2013, there were 830 deaths. I just showed you a headline from that. Between 2020 and 2021, 677 in the Florida East Coast. And many of the deaths occurred January, February, March in a 3-month period. Yeah, the seagrass is disappearing for sure, particularly down in that area because, like pre-Fukushima, lots of studies were showing how anthropogenic pollution would come across to that area, be added to the pollution indexes because it lingered over there for many months at a time. So when Fukushima happened, it just bombed straight over and done the same thing. Manatee deaths in Florida point to a global decline in seagrass. Global decline, right, worldwide. It's not just a Florida thing. Even though a lot of the Florida stories will fixate that it's Florida, it's simply not true. But that's a very revealing headline, is a global decline. Because Fukushima is a global event. Fukushima is a global event. Right, I got pictures like that from 2015, 16, and 17 in particular, when we were up on all the way to Alaska and back, right? 100%. It was symmetrical throughout all the Pacific coastline that I was looking at. Seagrass meadows serves, by the way, as a habitat for thousands of species, like sharks and turtles, as well as manatee. The smaller fish, shellfish, crustaceans, is not just a manatee. Everything had disappeared out of the ecosystem. But the manatees are at the top of the food chain in that ecosystem, and they're dependent on that environment, see? So then they talk about the manatee generally, but you don't hear about all the other species disappearing. Right? because they're actually gone. That's what I discovered on the research expedition. From Australia, southern East Asia to Europe and America's exposited reason for the declines is fairly universal. Deteriorating water quality. No, it's the ocean is pulsing every second because of Fukushima. OSU scientists say the ocean oxygen level is too low too early. Right, because the Pacific Ocean was about 50% of the oxygen for the entire planet, for goodness sakes. And so that was heavily saturated with radioactive fallout, right? I'll speed that up for you. So you see the radioactive fallout, all the oceans were devastated immediately in 1 week. Okay, let's say 2 weeks. It's a continuous plume of radioactive is still coming out today, but you can't see it or smell it or taste it or hear it. But you better get your asses in gear and do something about it. That's what's going on. And they got a collapse in the Alaskan Yukon River because there's no glaciers to feed the fresh water, the cold water, down the river and regulate the temperatures and raise the level of the rivers so the steelheads and trout and salmon can get up and spawn, right? So after a few years of that not happening, there's no eggs left to produce next year to come back, right? Or the cycle to come back. No one can say for certain why there are so few fish. Yeah, I can. Because there's no glaciers. We wiped out the glaciers from the Fukushima radioactive fallout. Like, this is not a game. I'm not screaming Fukushima because I'm bored. Ocean hypoxia could cause massive dead zones off the coast. Really? It could be all the thousands of nuclear dumps they dumped into the ocean. They just drove around the ocean, dropping radiation, radioactive barrels over the side of the boat. Never stopped the boat, just driving everywhere, throwing radioactive fuel over the side of the boat. They're all dead zones now, right? Okay, never done a show last night. I had heat stroke. The landlord sold this house. I got to move out of it. And I got another place, and I'm slowly moving my stuff into it. But it doesn't have a garage. And so I bought one of those Saturday. I went in and bought one of those 12 feet by 20 feet tarp garages, right? What's the name of them? Shelter Logics. They're 8 feet high, 12 feet wide, 20 feet long. And yesterday I put the frame together by myself and I almost died because the heat from the sun was burning right on me. I got to get it done, see? And I went back today and I had the heat stroke last night. And so today I had to go back, wake up this morning, just run back there and finish the frame. But it's too windy to put the tarp on it, but I can't put the tarp on it. Tomorrow I got to go pick up. Now that cost me $600. Almost $600, taxes included. And today I went and got the welding or the machine shop to make me up 24 stakes because these things got to get staked down. There's 3 stakes for each leg. And there's 8 legs, so 24 will do, right? It comes with 4 stakes. And then that's going to cost me $100. I already paid for that. I'll pick that up tomorrow. And the stakes they got are too big for the holes, so they're going to drill out the holes in all the legs. But I got the framing up. Now tomorrow I'm going to pick up 20 sheets of plywood, of just a 1/4 inch plywood. And they're $26.50 a sheet. So it's close. By the time you pay taxes, $26.50 with taxes, a sheet, and I got to pick up 20 sheets of it, and then I got to pick up those C clamps. And so the C clamps go over the frame. You know, the C clamps like you would use on a muffler or something like that, like a horseshoe clamp. So I can take it apart later, right? And so you put 6 of them on each sheet of plywood, and that's to stop anybody from breaking in and to give it integrity, but to stop anybody from breaking in and stealing the equipment. because I can't keep it all in my new spot. I don't have any room, right? And so should I rent a place at $200 a month? Or should I build a permanent place for myself that I can take down and move for around $1,200, right? That was the question. And I can't afford to pay $200 extra a month because I've been bankrupt for many years doing this. And so I haven't got the money, but tomorrow I am going to go pick up 20 sheets of plywood, 4x8 sheets of plywood. And I'll shoot some videos tomorrow for everybody so you can actually get a look at what I'm doing so you can wrap your mind around it. And so we got all kinds of equipment and outboard motors and generators we got to protect, right? We got to have it in a nice shelter, but we also got to be able to lock the door, and you can't do that in a tarp tent. Somebody can walk up in the dark and just split it open and walk away with all of our equipment that we worked so hard to get together that we need for research, right? And so in desperation, I got myself ran literally into the ground trying to accomplish this because I got to move out of here in about 10 days. Because this place is sold, thank goodness. Because that's torture. Being in a house that's for sale. I've never experienced that. And I'll never do something like that again. But anyway, so I got another spot. And so I'm going to miss a few days at the end of the month when I transfer everything over. And maybe not. I'm working hard so we don't miss any time, any of these presentations. I just want people to know that I'm ran ragged, but at nighttime I do this stuff here where I put it all together, and we're back. I didn't do a show last night. I was going to do a show last night on 911. It was impossible. I haven't had a second's break Friday, Saturday, or Sunday because I got the new place now. I got to start running on that, right? Well, I'll catch up. We'll do a 911 video maybe this week or next week, but we'll get it. And that's it. That's it for the show tonight. I just wanted to explain to people why I didn't do a show last night. I actually had heat stroke. You can probably see my head is actually burnt. I thought summer was over here because we're in the Atlantic. I'll say a quick good night to everybody. John. Yeah, I'm going to put a security camera in there, but I don't have a budget. I got to spend $600 on plywood tomorrow that I don't even have. And that's just to do the walls, the back, the front, and the roof. That don't give me a floor, right? It's going to be staked down. No one's going to lift it up because it weighs a ton now, but I got to get a floor into it. I was going to use pallets and raise hopefully some money and get thicker plywood and put on top of the pallets and use as a temporary floor. Like, I'm in panic mode because we're struggling. You know, I haven't even got the boat in the friggin' water. I can't afford to get that fixed yet. I got to take care of a garage. It's a big enough garage I can put all the stuff into it anyway. And I'm struggling. James, good night. I only serve one king. Lori, good night. Thank you. Christian, Dana Nasana. James Oldhand. Hi, everybody. Serge. Let me fix this. Hang on 1 second. Just give me 1 second. Because the comment section is on an external computer, I have to pinch it, make it readable for me. Scott, good night, everybody. Andrew B. Anna C3. God bless everybody. Hugs for everybody. We'll see everybody hopefully tomorrow night. I got to go down and pick up all that plywood tomorrow morning, get it back. I got to get all the other C-clamps to put on it. I got to drill it the hole, start bolting it on. There might not be no show tomorrow night because I'm overloaded. KDS, I'm ran into the ground. Ella, good night, everybody. I'm just warning you, if there is no show tonight, you know why? It's because I'm not even healthy, for God's sakes, and I got to build a garage, a 12-foot by 20-foot garage by myself. It's absurd. It's absurd what the planet has got done to me. Shane. Hi, Shane. I'm glad you found me. Jeffrey Brown. Good night, everyone. Just quick shout out to everybody in the comments section. Everybody else, hi, everybody. Hugs for everybody. Who's watching this later tonight and tomorrow and right now. God bless you for hearing me out. Thank you. Appreciate it. Chuck, I'm just doing a call out. Shout out for the comments section. I'll come down to the most recent comments in a second here. Looks like we got through it. Mark even got himself banded here tonight. You can't come in and pick on Dana, man. Don't work that way. And it's ludicrous to suggest that Organic Slant was ignorant with you, because he's not ignorant with anybody. You were ignorant is what the problem was. And he called you on it. But he's not. He won't be mean. Hey, Daryl. Good night, everyone. And I'm not going to sit there and put up with it. And S Official. Steve Edwards. Thanks, Ella. John. Anna. Lori. John. Yeah, I like to get a camera, but I got to get the plywood. I will buy a camera when I got enough money to spare. If you want to donate, there's links below, folks. The bottom of the description, there's only 2 ways to donate to me. They're both at the very bottom of the description. We've been doing it for years, never an issue. Hugs for everybody. We'll see everybody in the next show when I can. Have a great night, everyone. And a great day tomorrow. I'm going to pick up 20 sheets of plywood and get that garage secured so we got a spot. We don't lose our investment. So total, that'll cost me $1,200 in the last couple of days. And we raised $300 last week. It's tough being honest, I tell you what. Have a great night, everyone. We'll see everybody soon. Take care now. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Costs as little and goes a long way. Make a playlist. It helps sure you make your own URL when you make a playlist. And my video might actually get found. Good night, everybody.